Today, we are talking about one of the most audacious, unbelievable, and, let's be honest, kind of insane engineering projects in all of history. We're talking about the time an entire city looked around, decided it was sitting in the wrong spot, and instead of moving, it just went up.
All right, let's just start with a question that sounds like it's straight out of a movie. Could you imagine checking into a big, fancy hotel, going to sleep, and waking up to find out the entire building has been quietly lifted 6 feet into the sky? It sounds completely impossible, right?
Well, get this. Not only is it possible, it actually happened. Back in 1861, Chicago's enormous, multi-story brick Tremont House Hotel was hoisted 6 feet into the air so smoothly that the guests inside just went about their day totally oblivious. But the truly mind-bending part isn't just that they could do it, it's why on earth they had to. And to answer that, we've got to get our boots dirty, so to speak. See, the reason for this incredible stunt was Chicago's central, inescapable, and deadly problem. The whole city was basically built in a swamp, and it was sinking into a sea of its own muck. You know, early Chicago was built on what you could call a geographical curse. The city was basically a giant, flat sponge right next to Lake Michigan. This meant the water table, the level of groundwater, was just a couple of feet below the surface. So if you tried to dig down for anything, you'd immediately hit water. That made proper drainage impossible. And no drainage meant no basements, no cellars, and most critically, no sewers. And this pretty much sums up the result. The mud in Chicago was legendary. We're not just talking about a little mess after it rained. It was a genuine hazard. Horses would get swallowed up, people would lose their boots in this thick, gluey sludge, and shop owners would actually post signs like this one in the middle of the street as a kind of grim, funny warning. The city was literally being swallowed by the ground. But it stopped being funny when the situation turned deadly. With no way to get rid of sewage and waste, the city's streets became, for all intents and purposes, open sewers. And all that stagnant, contaminated water, it was a perfect breeding ground for diseases like typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. This gem of the West, as they called it, had become a public health nightmare. And the human cost was just staggering. In 1 year, 1854, cholera killed more than 1,400 people. Now, that might not sound like a huge number today, but that was nearly 6% of the entire city's population at the time. To put that in perspective, that would be like losing over 160,000 people in modern-day Chicago in a single year. The city was literally dying. It needed a fix, and it needed one fast. So the city council knew they needed a sewer system, but the laws of physics were completely against them. So they did what you do when you have an impossible problem. They brought in an expert, a man who would propose a solution so radical it was almost unbelievable. And this is our Guy Ellis Chesbro. He was a well-respected engineer from Boston, and Chicago handed him this giant dilemma. See, sewer systems need one simple thing to work: gravity. They need a downward slope for things to flow. But Chicago was, as they said, pancake flat. So how in the world do you drain a city that has nowhere to drain to? The standard solution, just digging down, was obviously a non-starter. You'd basically be digging in a lake. So Chesbro just flipped the entire concept on its head. His idea? Don't dig down. Instead, build the new sewer system directly on top of the existing streets, and then just bury them. Cover them with dirt and create an entirely new, higher street level for the whole city. It was a brilliant idea, right? But it created an even bigger, more obvious problem. Okay, so you raise all the streets by, say, 10 feet. What happens to every single building in the city? Suddenly, everyone's front doors is in what would be a basement. So what do you do with the city that's already there? And this is the moment that defines the entire story. Chesbro's answer was as simple as it was completely audacious. He basically said, if the buildings are in the way, then lift the buildings. Lift all of them. And just like that, one of the most surreal chapters in urban history began. The city council actually approved the plan, and Chicago got ready to literally defy gravity. But how? In an age with no hydraulic cranes, no modern power tools, how do you physically lift a metropolis? The answer was this humble but incredibly powerful piece of technology: the jack screw. It's a really simple machine. It just uses a screw thread to turn rotational motion into a powerful vertical lift. One person turning one jack screw can lift a few tons.
So an army of people turning thousands of them could, in theory, lift a city. So the process itself was just this incredible ballet of coordination. First, work crews would dig these trenches to get underneath a building's foundation. Then they'd slide in these massive timbers to create a whole new support frame. Step 3, they'd place hundreds, sometimes thousands of jack screws under those timbers. But the crucial moment, the magic trick, was step 4. A foreman would blow a whistle, and every single worker would give their jack screw a precise, identical turn. Inch by inch, the whole building would rise, and then they could finally build a new foundation in the gap they'd created.
Now, they started with smaller wooden buildings to get the hang of it, but the true test of this whole system was the building we started with, the Tremont House. This wasn't just some building, it was a landmark, a 6-story solid brick behemoth that took up an entire city block. A lot of people were convinced that the second they tried to lift it, the whole thing would just crumble into a pile of bricks.
The sheer scale of this one job was just staggering. The engineer in charge, a young guy named George Pullman, who, by the way, would later get famous for his railway cars, he assembled a crew of 500 men to operate 5,000 jack screws, all working together in the dark, cramped space underneath the hotel. It was a massive, synchronized industrial performance. And the precision was just unbelievable. As we said, the lift was so gentle, the guests had no clue. And this wasn't a one-off thing. All over the city, as entire blocks of shops and offices were being raised, the businesses often just stayed open. People would literally walk up these temporary wooden ramps to go into a store that was floating in midair. So for almost 2 decades, Chicago was this chaotic, surreal landscape of floating buildings and shifting sidewalks. But once the project was finally done, it left this strange and permanent mark on the city's architecture, a kind of secret level hidden in plain sight. This right here is the ghost of the Great Lifting. If you walk through some of the older neighborhoods in Chicago today, you'll see these really peculiar buildings. It looks like their first floors are kind of sunken into the ground, with windows right there at sidewalk level. You'd think the building just settled weirdly over time. So it makes you ask the question, right? Why does this architectural quirk exist all over the city? Was it just some strange design choice? Did the whole city just sink a few feet over the last century? And here is the brilliant twist. The buildings aren't underground. The street is in the air. That sunken level you're looking at, that was the original ground floor of Chicago. The sidewalk you're standing on is the new, artificial grade they built on top of Chesbrough sewers. You're literally walking on a layer of 19th century ambition. But there is a final, tragic chapter to this story. The sewers and the new raised grade were a massive success. They saved the city. But a lot of the new infrastructure, the sidewalks, the road supports, it was all made of wood. So in 1871, when the Great Chicago Fire tore through the city, this wooden framework acted like a giant wick, helping the fires spread like crazy. Much of the city they had so carefully lifted burned down. But, and this is key, the foundation they had built, that high, dry land, it survived. When Chicago rebuilt, it did so on the solid ground it had made for itself. So, you see, the story of Chicago's Great Lift is so much more than just an amazing engineering feat. It's really a testament to human ingenuity when faced with what seems like an impossible problem. Which kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. What are the swamps we're facing today? And what brilliantly simple, maybe even audacious idea? What's our modern-day jack screw that we might be overlooking?